The shovel struck hard earth for the 100th time that morning, each clang echoing across the barren Wyoming landscape like a death knell. Ezra McKinnon wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, his calloused hands trembling not from exertion, but from the weight of his decision. The rectangular hole before him was nearly 6 feet deep now, just wide enough for a man of his lean frame. He'd chosen this spot behind his dilapidated ranch house, where the morning sun would warm the ground and the evening shadows would offer peace. At 52, he figured he'd lived long enough to know when hope had finally abandoned a man. The cattle had died 3 winters running, claimed by disease and brutal cold that seemed to seep into a man's very bones. His wife Martha had followed them into the frozen ground 2 springs past, taken by the fever that swept through the territory like wildfire through dry grass. Their only son had headed east after the funeral, speaking harsh words about failure and broken promises that still cut deeper than any blade. Now the bank notice crumpled in his shirt pocket spoke of foreclosure, of dreams turned to dust, in a land that demanded everything and gave back nothing. The grave he dug wasn't just for his body. It was for the last remnants of the life he'd tried to build. A meadowlark's song drifted across the prairie, its melody hauntingly beautiful against the backdrop of his despair. Ezra paused, leaning heavily on the shovel handle as he gazed toward the distant mountains that had once promised adventure and prosperity. Those peaks now seemed like silent judges, watching his descent into hopelessness with cold indifference. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, familiar smells that had once meant home, but now felt like accusations. He'd come west with Martha 25 years ago, full of dreams and determination, believing the frontier would reward hard work and perseverance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him freeze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Through the heat shimmer rising from the plains, he could make out a covered wagon moving slowly toward his property, its canvas top bleached white by the relentless sun. Panic seized him as he realized what this scene must look like. A man standing in a freshly dug grave, shovel in hand, the very picture of madness or guilt. He scrambled up from the hole, dirt cascading from his boots, and quickly grabbed an old tarp to throw over the excavation. The wagon was close enough now that he could hear the creak of its wheels and the steady plodding of tired oxen. As the wagon drew nearer, Ezra's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. The driver appeared to be just a child, a girl of perhaps 14, with auburn hair escaping from a faded bonnet. Beside her sat 2 smaller girls, their faces smudged with trail dust, but their eyes bright with curiosity. The wagon itself looked to have traveled countless miles, its sides patched and repatched, loaded with the meager possessions of people who had lost everything. When the girl pulled the oxen to a halt near his front porch, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the creaking of the wagon settling and the soft lowing of his few remaining cattle in the distant pasture. "Afternoon, mister," the oldest girl called out, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. Her green eyes held a wariness that spoke of hardships endured and disappointments weathered. Yet there was something else there too, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. The 2 younger girls, one perhaps 10 and the other no more than 7, peered at him with the frank curiosity of children who had seen too much of the world too soon. Their dresses were clean but patched, their hair braided with care despite the obvious poverty of their circumstances. The sight of them stirred something in Ezra's chest that he'd thought had died with his own family. "We heard in town that you might be looking for help," the girl continued, climbing down from the wagon with the practiced ease of someone who had been driving teams since childhood. Her boots hit the dusty ground with determination, and she straightened her shoulders as if preparing for battle. Behind her, the younger girls remained seated, their wide eyes taking in the ramshackle ranch buildings, the broken fence posts, and the general air of abandonment that hung over the place like a shroud. The middle child, a blonde girl with solemn blue eyes, clutched a rag doll to her chest as if it were her most precious possession. Ezra's throat felt as dry as the desert wind as he struggled to find his voice. No one had come looking for work in over a year, not since word had spread about his string of misfortunes and his inability to pay wages. The bank notice in his pocket seemed to crackle with accusation, reminding him that he had nothing to offer these children but disappointment and broken dreams. Yet something in their faces, a mixture of desperation and stubborn courage, made him hesitate before sending them away. They looked like refugees from their own private disaster, and he recognized in their eyes the same hollow ache that had driven him to dig his own grave just moments before. "I'm not sure what you heard, miss, but—" he began, then stopped as the youngest girl suddenly smiled at him with such radiant warmth that it nearly took his breath away. She had dark curls that had escaped their ribbon and framed a face that reminded him painfully of Martha at that age. Her innocence was like a physical force, cutting through his despair and confusion with surgical precision. The way she looked at him, without judgment, without fear, with simple human connection, made something long dormant stir in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him with anything other than pity or contempt that he'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to another human being. The oldest girl stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet dignity that commanded respect despite her youth and circumstances. "We're the Morrison sisters," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. "I'm Sarah, this is Emma, and the little one is Lucy. Our pa died of the cholera 3 weeks back, and our ma passed 2 years before that. We've been traveling since, looking for somewhere to belong." The words were delivered with a straightforward honesty that cut straight to the heart, and Ezra found himself staring into eyes that held depths of sorrow no child should ever know. Yet there was steel there too, forged by necessity and tempered by loss, and he realized these weren't just children seeking charity. They were survivors, looking for a chance to build something new from the ashes of their old life. The weight of the bank notice in Ezra's pocket seemed to double as he looked at the 3 girls standing before him like a jury waiting for his verdict. Sarah's steady gaze never wavered, even as the wind whipped her auburn hair around her face, and he could see in her posture the kind of strength that came from carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. Emma, the middle child, had climbed down from the wagon and now stood slightly behind her older sister, one small hand resting protectively on Lucy's shoulder as the youngest girl peered at him with those bright, trusting eyes. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and desperate hopes that hung in the air like morning mist over the prairie. "You girls been traveling alone all this time?" Ezra asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. The thought of 3 children wandering the dangerous frontier roads, vulnerable to every predator and peril the territory could offer, made his stomach clench with a protective instinct he thought had died with his son's departure. Sarah nodded, her jaw set with grim determination that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. "We've managed just fine," she said, though the slight defiance in her tone suggested they'd faced challenges she wasn't willing to admit to a stranger. The tarp-covered hole behind him seemed to mock his own struggles. Here he was, a grown man ready to surrender, while these children had found the courage to keep moving forward. Lucy suddenly broke away from her sisters and skipped toward him with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her dark curls bouncing with each step. "Are you sad, mister?" she asked, tilting her head to study his face with the directness only children possessed. Her innocence hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of conversations with his son at that same age, when questions were simple and love was unconditional. "You look like Papa did after Mama went to heaven," she continued, her small voice carrying a wisdom that broke his heart. "But Sarah says heaven people watch over us, so maybe your heaven people are watching too." The simple faith in her words made him want to both laugh and cry. Emotions he'd kept buried for so long, they felt foreign in his chest. Emma stepped forward, her blue eyes serious beyond her years as she regarded the rundown ranch with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to assess opportunities and risks in equal measure. "We can work hard," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of promises made and kept. "Sarah taught me to milk cows and tend chickens, and Lucy's real good at gathering eggs without breaking them. We don't eat much, and we can sleep in the barn if you need us to." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of their skills and their willingness to accept whatever shelter he might provide struck him with the force of a revelation. These children weren't begging for charity, they were offering partnership. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and Ezra found himself really looking at his ranch for the first time in months, seeing it through their eyes rather than through the lens of his own failure. The barn, though in need of repair, was still structurally sound, and the chicken coop could be restored with a little effort and determination. His few remaining cattle were healthy enough, and the well still provided clean water even if the windmill needed attention. What he'd seen as evidence of his inadequacy, they might see as potential, raw material for building something better. The realization that he'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd failed to see what remained hit him with startling clarity. Sarah moved closer, her expression softening as she seemed to sense the internal battle raging within him. "We heard in town that you lost your family," she said gently, her young voice carrying a compassion that came from personal experience with grief. "We know what that feels like, mister. The empty feeling that follows you around like a shadow. The way everything reminds you of what used to be." Her words struck him like arrows finding their mark, each one a recognition of pain he'd thought was his alone to bear. "But maybe," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "maybe we could help each other remember what it feels like to have family again." The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the yard and causing the loose boards on the porch to creak and groan like old bones settling. Lucy had wandered over to examine the few scraggly wildflowers growing near the house, her delight in their simple beauty evident in the way she knelt to smell them and smiled at their faded colors. "Look, Emma," she called out, her voice bright with wonder. "They're still trying to be pretty even though nobody's been taking care of them." The innocent observation felt like a metaphor for everything broken and abandoned in his life, yet somehow her words carried hope rather than accusation. Emma had moved to examine the chicken coop, running her small hands along the wire mesh and testing the strength of the posts with the practiced eye of someone who understood the value of solid construction. "This could be fixed up real nice," she called over to Sarah, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. "And there's good grazing for the cattle, if we can mend some of this fencing." The way she said "we," as if their acceptance was already a foregone conclusion, made something tight in his chest begin to loosen. When had he stopped seeing possibilities and started seeing only problems? Sarah stepped closer still, close enough that he could see the freckles scattered across her nose and the determined set of her mouth that reminded him so much of Martha when she'd made up her mind about something. "We're not asking for charity, Mr." She paused, waiting for his name with the polite expectation of proper introductions. "McKinnon," he supplied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ezra McKinnon." She nodded gravely, as if his name carried weight and significance. "Mr. McKinnon, we're asking for a chance to prove we're worth keeping around, a chance to make this place feel like home again." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. The bank notice crackled again as Ezra shifted his weight, and he realized that these children represented something he hadn't even known he was searching for. Not just help with the ranch work, but a reason to fight the foreclosure, a purpose beyond his own survival. Looking at them now, dusty and travel-worn but unbowed by their circumstances, he saw reflected not his own failures, but his own younger self, full of dreams and determination to build something lasting on this harsh but beautiful land. The grave he'd been digging suddenly seemed not like an ending, but like a symbol of everything he'd been burying. Hope, purpose, the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. These three girls, strangers who had appeared like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying, were offering him something more precious than gold. They were offering him a chance to matter again. The decision hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire, and Ezra felt the weight of three pairs of eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and barely concealed fear. Behind him, the tarp-covered hole seemed to whisper accusations of cowardice and surrender, while before him stood living proof that courage could wear the face of children who refused to give up despite losing everything. "You can stay," he heard himself say, the words tumbling out before his rational mind could object with all the reasons why this was impossible. Sarah's face lit up with a smile so radiant it seemed to chase away the shadows that had settled over his heart, while Lucy clapped her hands together in pure joy. Emma simply nodded, as if she'd known all along that this was how it would end. The next morning brought the first real test of their newfangled arrangement, when Ezra discovered just how much work three determined girls could accomplish before sunrise. Sarah had already milked his old cow Bessie and gathered eggs from the surviving chickens, while Emma had somehow coaxed the temperamental windmill back to life with nothing more than determination and a bent wire. Lucy had appointed herself keeper of the vegetable garden, carefully watering each struggling plant as if her attention alone could will them back to health. The sight of them working together with such natural efficiency made him realize how much he'd let slide in his descent into despair. But their presence also brought complications he hadn't anticipated, starting with the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley 3 days after they'd settled in. The lawman rode up to the house with the grim expression of someone bearing unwelcome news, his weathered face set in lines that spoke of too many difficult conversations. "Ezra," he said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been punished by years in the saddle, "I've got to ask about the girls. Word's gotten around town, and there's questions being raised about propriety and such." The implication hung between them like a loaded gun, and Ezra felt his jaw clench with anger at the small-minded gossips who could turn an act of kindness into something sordid. Sarah appeared on the porch as if she'd been listening from inside, her spine straight and her chin raised in defiance of anyone who might question her family's right to exist. "Sheriff Bradley," she said with a politeness that carried an edge of steel, "we're not causing any trouble, and Mr. McKinnon has been nothing but a gentleman and a godsend to us orphans." Her choice of words was deliberate and pointed, reminding the sheriff of their vulnerable status while defending Ezra's character with a maturity that belied her years. Behind her, Emma and Lucy peered through the doorway, their faces reflecting the fear of children who had learned that adults in positions of authority could change their lives with a single decision. The sheriff's expression softened slightly as he took in the sight of the three girls, clearly well-fed and properly clothed, despite their humble circumstances. "I'm not doubting anybody's intentions here," he said carefully, his tone gentler now as he addressed Sarah directly. "But there's proper channels for these things, legal guardianship and such. Can't have folks saying we don't follow the law, even out here, where the law's sometimes more of a suggestion than a rule." His words carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many good intentions go wrong, but also the sympathy of a man who understood that sometimes rules needed to bend in the face of human need. That evening, as they sat around the rough wooden table, sharing a meal of beans and cornbread that somehow tasted better than any feast Ezra had eaten in years, Sarah brought up the elephant in the room with her characteristic directness. "We could move on if it's going to cause you trouble," she said, though the pain in her voice made it clear how much the offer cost her. "We've done it before, and we can do it again if we need to." Emma's fork clattered against her plate as she looked up sharply, while Lucy's lower lip began to tremble with the threat of tears. The thought of sending them back out onto the dangerous roads, alone and unprotected, made Ezra's stomach turn with a sick feeling he recognized as the same desperation that had driven him to dig that grave. But it was Lucy who provided the solution with the innocent wisdom that seemed to flow from her like water from a spring. "Why can't you just be our papa?" she asked, her dark eyes wide with confusion, at the complexity adults insisted on creating around simple problems. Sarah says sometimes people choose to be family even when they're not born that way, and we already live together and take care of each other like families do. Her words hung in the sudden silence, like a revelation, so obvious and yet so profound that it took Ezra's breath away. The legal complications that seemed so insurmountable suddenly appeared manageable when viewed through the lens of a child's logic. The next morning brought another visitor, this time in the form of Reverend Samuel Hayes, whose arrival in his black suit and serious demeanor suggested that the town's concerns had reached the church as well. But instead of condemnation, the preacher brought an unexpected proposal that would change everything. "I've been thinking about your situation, Ezra," he said, settling his long frame into one of the kitchen chairs with the air of a man who had come to help rather than judge. "What if we made this arrangement official? Legal adoption papers drawn up proper, with the church and the community standing behind you. These girls need a father, and from what I can see, you need them just as much as they need you." The weight of the bank notice, still crumpled in his shirt pocket, reminded Ezra of the harsh reality that threatened to destroy any dreams of family he might dare to entertain. "Reverend," he said heavily, his voice thick with the shame of failure, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can barely keep this place running as it is. The bank's fixing to foreclose next month, and I don't have anywhere near enough to pay what I owe." The admission felt like ripping open an old wound, but the girls deserved to know the truth about the precarious nature of their newfangled home. Sarah's face went pale, but she didn't flinch, and he saw in her expression the same stubborn determination that had brought them to his door in the first place. It was then that the Reverend smiled, an expression that transformed his austere features and revealed the kind heart that had drawn him to the ministry in the first place. "That's where the beauty of community comes in, my friend," he said, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. Funny thing about small towns, sometimes the same gossips who cause problems are the first ones to open their purses when they realize they might lose something precious. The Ladies' Auxiliary has been collecting donations, and several of the ranchers have pledged cattle and supplies. Seems like folks have gotten attached to the idea of you and these girls making a go of it together. The pouch hit the table with a satisfying thump, and Ezra stared at it as if it were a miracle made manifest, which perhaps it was. The adoption ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in the small white church that served the scattered community, with half the town packed into the wooden pews to witness what many were calling a miracle. Ezra stood at the altar in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Martha's funeral 2 years prior, now cleaned and pressed for a far happier occasion. Beside him, Sarah, Emma, and Lucy wore new dresses donated by the Ladies' Auxiliary, their faces glowing with a joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire sanctuary. When Reverend Hayes asked if Ezra McKinnon would take these 3 girls as his lawful daughters to love and protect them for all the days of his life, his voice broke with emotion as he whispered, "I will." The months that followed transformed both the ranch and the man who ran it, as if the presence of laughter and purpose had breathed life back into everything the long loneliness had withered. The windmill hummed contentedly in the prairie wind, pumping clear water for gardens that flourished under Emma's careful attention and cattle that grew fat and healthy under Sarah's knowledgeable care. Lucy had appointed herself official keeper of the chickens, naming each bird and somehow coaxing them to lay more eggs than the coop had produced in years. Ezra found himself rising each morning, not with the leaden weight of despair, but with curiosity about what new adventure or challenge his daughters might present him with that day. The bank notice, now framed and hanging in the kitchen as a reminder of how close they'd all come to losing everything, had been paid in full, with money left over to purchase seed for spring planting. The community's generosity had extended beyond mere dollars, encompassing gifts of livestock, tools, and most importantly, acceptance of this unconventional family that had formed from necessity and blossomed into something beautiful. Even Sheriff Bradley had become a regular visitor, often stopping by on Sunday afternoons to sample Lucy's improving biscuit-making skills and to marvel at how 3 orphaned girls had managed to civilize the territory's most notorious hermit. But it was on a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, that Ezra finally found the courage to share with his daughters the secret of how close they'd come to never meeting at all. "Girls," he began, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as he pointed toward the spot behind the house where wildflowers now bloomed. "There's something I need to tell you about that patch of ground over there." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding, while Emma leaned forward with the intense attention she gave to all of life's important lessons. Lucy simply snuggled closer against his side, secure in the knowledge that whatever he had to say, it wouldn't change the love that surrounded her like a warm blanket. The story came out in fits and starts, interrupted by gasps of horror from Sarah and solemn nods of understanding from Emma, who seemed to grasp instinctively the depth of despair that could drive a good man to such extremes. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a held breath until Lucy looked up at him with those dark eyes that saw straight through to his soul. "But you didn't go in the hole, Papa," she said matter-of-factly, using the name that had evolved naturally over the months of shared meals and bedtime stories. "You climbed out and chose us instead. That makes you the bravest papa in the whole world." Her simple logic, delivered with absolute conviction, made his throat tight with unshed tears of gratitude. Sarah reached over to take his weathered hand in her small one, her touch gentle but firm, with the strength she'd developed from carrying responsibilities beyond her years. "We all saved each other," she said quietly, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to step back from the edge. "You were digging a grave for your old life, and we were wandering around dead inside, even though we were still breathing. But together, we planted something new in that ground, hope and love, and the kind of family that chooses to stay together no matter what storms come." Her words hung in the evening air like a benediction, blessing the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them all home to each other. Emma, ever practical, had been thinking through the implications of his revelation with the careful consideration she applied to all problems requiring solutions. "Does this mean we don't ever have to worry about you leaving us?" she asked, her blue eyes serious but hopeful. "Because we've gotten kind of used to having a papa, and we'd be mighty upset if you decided to go anywhere without us." Her attempt at levity couldn't quite hide the fear that lurked beneath the surface, the terror of abandonment that all 3 girls carried like invisible scars from their losses. Ezra pulled her close, gathering all 3 of his daughters into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Lucy asked the question that had been building in her young mind throughout the evening's revelations. "Papa, if we hadn't come that day, would you really have stayed in that hole forever?" The innocence of her query, delivered without judgment or accusation, cut straight to the heart of the matter with the precision only children possessed. Ezra considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty was the foundation upon which their newfangled family had been built, and that anything less than truth would be a betrayal of the trust they'd placed in him. "I thought I would, little one," he said finally. "I thought I was all used up with nothing left to give. But you girls showed me that sometimes, when you think you're at the end, you're really just at the beginning of something better." The prairie wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of rain as they sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the miraculous chain of events that had brought them to this moment. The ranch, once a monument to failure and loss, now buzzed with life and possibility, its buildings sturdy and well-maintained, its fields green with the promise of a good harvest. The cattle lowed contentedly in the distance, and the windmill turned lazily in the breeze, pumping life-giving water for crops and family alike. It was Emma who finally broke the silence with an observation that made them all smile. "I guess sometimes the best families are the ones you dig out of the ground instead of the ones you're born into." Years later, when Ezra had silver in his hair and grandchildren playing in the yard where he'd once dug his own grave, he would still remember that first evening when 3 strangers had appeared on the horizon like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to pray. The Morrison sisters had become the McKinnon daughters, and in saving his life, they had discovered the profound truth that sometimes the deepest graves we dig are the ones meant to bury our old selves so that something new and beautiful can grow in their place. The lonely rancher had indeed dug his own grave, but instead of an ending, it had become the foundation for a beginning that would last for generations, proving that love, like wildflowers on the prairie, could bloom in the most unexpected places and transform even the most barren ground into something abundant and full of life.